Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. And of course, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. This segment, an interesting story indeed. We're going to be talking about Dickey Chappelle, the first American female war correspondent to be killed in action. Brand new work, an interesting one called Dickey Chappelle Under Fire, photographs from the first American female war correspondent killed in action by John Garafolo. Who is John Garafolo? Interesting resume indeed here for this young man that we're going to be talking to. He's a screenwriter, college professor, former entertainment industry, advertising and marketing executive. He's also a veteran of the Iraq War. He provided security and escorted members of the international media into Iraq during the initial phase of the war. He's currently a commander of the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve on active duty, signed to Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. It makes me tired just reading that thing. John, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks very much, Warner. And if it makes you feel any better, it makes me feel old listening to you say all that.
Well, let's talk just a little bit more about you. Again, you were in the entertainment industry, and you got your PhD from Southern Cal, the School of Cinematic Arts there. And I'm curious as to what drew you to the theater. Did you want to act, or did you want to write or produce? What did you want to do?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because when I first started, I went to a community college, and I had never thought about acting at all. I was always interested in writing to a certain extent, but it never really had given a whole lot of thought about it as a career. It was just something I liked to do. And one of my friends dragged me into an acting class. He said, "Be a great way to meet girls and all that." And I thought, well, I guess it can't hurt. Why not? And so I did. And then he was right. It was a great way to meet girls. I also met a lot of other great people and everything. And so from that standpoint, it was a very, very positive thing. And I did some acting for a little while. And essentially, I really used that as an opportunity to kind of say, hey, I really do like the writing a lot better. Even though everybody imagines themselves to be a great actor, that certainly wasn't me. But it really did kind of solidify the fact that writing was something that I wanted to do more of. And so that was always in the back of my mind as something that during the course of my life I wanted to focus on.
I'm aware that some British actors and American ones, David Niven and several others, obviously, have gone from the fine arts and the theater into service to their country. I'm curious as to how you made that move.
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned David Niven. He's a great role model in that respect. Most people don't know that Niven went to Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of West Point. And he really did have quite a background as originally anyway in his youth as a military guy. But in my case, it was really different. When I hit 30, I sort of looked at my life and said, what were the things that I sort of wanted to do? And go to grad school was one of them. Run my own business was another thing. And I'd always been interested in the military, and I kind of revisited the military. And at that point, it just didn't make any sense for me to sort of stop life and do something else. But I gravitated toward the reserve component. And living in Southern California, the Coast Guard seemed to be an ideal choice for doing just that. And so that essentially is how I ended up in the military. And, of course, anything that happened after that was nothing that I had planned, and it just sort of had evolved into something that I had never anticipated, and certainly couldn't have anticipated 9/11 happening, which really did change my life a lot in many regards.
Yeah, indeed it did. Tell us specifically how it did for you.
Well, I was recalled to active duty very shortly after 9/11, and at the time I was in the Coast Guard Reserve, and I had been assigned to a Navy unit, believe it or not. So I was one of a small group of Coast Guardsmen in a Naval Coastal Warfare unit, and we were recalled to active duty, and we were going to support the Afghanistan mission. And so I was essentially sent down to San Diego, and with the rest of the people in my unit, they were assembling a squadron for deployment. And then essentially after 40 days, they canceled the mission, and so my orders were canceled, and I went back home. Until about a year later, when I was involuntarily recalled to active duty again to go to support Operation Iraqi Freedom.
So the whole world and the whole life of Dickey Chappelle, how did that get into your wheelhouse? How did it get to your attention? How did it get your interest?
It was initially as a function of doing just some basic professional reading for the Coast Guard. I had been assigned to, as a reservist, I was assigned to an 82-foot patrol boat, and one of the people that I had worked with had mentioned, hey, you should check out this book called Brown Water Black Beret. It talked about the Brown Water Navy in Vietnam, and there's several chapters that talk about the Coast Guard, including the 82-foot patrol boats that were operating in Vietnam. And so, sounds great. So I went out and got the book and read through it. And in Brown Water Black Beret, there's a chapter about Dickey Chappelle, and I had never heard of her before. Didn't even know that there were women war correspondents that were out there, and I was really fascinated because it's a great story. And I was shocked that I had never heard of Dickey Chappelle in general, and I thought her story was really so marvelous and so interesting that I really was shocked that there wasn't a movie. And so that was my initial kind of thought. It's like, hey, I think that there's a movie here. And so, of course, I spent a lot of time doing some research. It was a lot harder than it is now. I mean, now you can do a Google search or any other type of search engine, and you can find out a lot of stuff. Well, at that point, I had to do it the old-fashioned way, so it took a lot more time. But I was able to find out that there was an archive of her work at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and her brother had been a professor, in fact, was still a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And as luck would have it, one of my cousins was living in Madison at the time. She actually graduated from UW, and her husband was still there, going to medical school. And so I contacted her, and she was able to do some of the initial research for me, pulled a couple of things from the archive, and found Dr. Robert Meyer's phone number, and so that kind of started the ball rolling on the Chappelle project.
So, the more you learned about Dickey Chappelle, how did your opinion? Of course, you didn't have an opinion to begin with, but what's sort of the headline from her? What was the thing that really, really stood out for you?
Well, the thing about Dickey Chappelle that was the most amazing to me is the fact that she really was a trailblazer during her life. And there certainly were other women war correspondents. I mean, she certainly wasn't the only one, but she was one of a few. And the fact that she had started out as a war correspondent beginning in World War II and continued on to Vietnam, to me, was really pretty extraordinary. Because not only was she a war correspondent, she did it for a really long time. And just the amount of different types of combat operations that she covered throughout the world were really pretty amazing. And in fact, there were some people that were in the Marine Corps towards the end of her life in 1965 that had known about her for a long time, would tell people, it's like, hey, she's got more combat experience than you do, so you should probably listen to her, because she wasn't just an interloper that was just saying, hey, this is kind of like a cool thing to do. And she was really dedicated to what she had done. And the fact that she was so dedicated to tell a story and tell a story that would often put her in situations that could get her killed repeatedly, and she still kept on doing it, was really, I thought, very extraordinary.
So was she an independent writer? Did she work for the networks, or did she work for any particular publication, or just did it on her own as freelance?
She was mostly a freelancer during the course of her career, and initially when she was a correspondent for World War II, or during World War II, she was initially credentialed to do some work for Look magazine. So they were the ones that put in the credential for her, and then from there on, she ended up getting credentialed by a publication called Life Story, which was published by Fawcett Publications, and that essentially got her out to the war in the Pacific. But otherwise, she worked as a freelancer and had articles that appeared in Life magazine. She had articles that appeared in Reader's Digest. She did a lot of work for Reader's Digest and in the late 50s through early 60s. She also had photographs that appeared in, believe it or not, Cosmopolitan from post-World War II. And, of course, the Cosmopolitan magazine in 1945 was very different than the one that we know of today. But her work got quite a large amount of exposure, but she never worked for any one particular organization. National Geographic probably would have been something that today we would certainly easily be able to find her work, and they were all photo essays. So it really tells kind of a picture of of her career as it evolved from the 1950s through the 1960s.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to John Garafolo. He is a writer, he's a producer, college professor, also served in the military and currently serves at the U.S. Coast Guard World Headquarters in D.C. He's the author of a new work called Dickey Chappelle, Dickey Chappelle Under Fire, photographs by the first American female war correspondent killed in action. Let's talk about the theater of war in which she was killed, which was Vietnam. Tell us a little bit about her going there and about her time there.
Okay. She had been a fairly experienced war correspondent by the time Vietnam rolled around in the 1960s, and in fact, she was probably one of the first women, if not the first woman, to actually cover combat operations in Vietnam. She was there in 1961, and she spent quite some time there working with Special Forces troops that were operating in the Vietnam and Laos border. And so essentially her view of Vietnam, in my opinion, is very, very interesting because she was there so early and there really weren't that many Americans relative to the presence that we had later on. And I think that tends to be what people sort of associate with Vietnam, that later year, certainly from 1968 on with the Tet Offensive. We had the highest concentration of troops. And so sometimes I think that the advisors that were there from the late 50s on through, say, 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident sort of sparked the actual buildup of the United States, I mean, real seriously. And so she showed pictures of Vietnamese villager life and the way that they were fighting essentially a civil war at the time. With the help of some military advisors from mostly the Army, the Navy. There were some Air Force guys there. But it was really a different view of Vietnam. And that's something that I felt was very, very interesting because some of her work really took on almost like an ethnographic quality, which was interesting also because of the fact that in the 50s, she had really not done a lot of war correspondent work at the beginning of the 1950s. And so her and her husband, or then husband, who was also a photographer, were traveling around the world working for different relief agencies. And so they saw a different view of the war, which is now that we've gone through this horrible situation and with devastating consequences, how do we put the world back together? So, it was interesting to see her stuff in the 1960s tying into her work from the 1950s with that sort of ethnographic kind of feel of village life. And, you saw more irregular forces than regular forces, so to speak. And so, I really feel that her view of Vietnam is something that's unique, that really hasn't been seen a lot, certainly since the end of the Vietnam War.
What kind of cooperation, help, advice, criticism, observations, et cetera, have you gotten from her family as you were producing this work?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because when I first started working on this, and I did get in touch with Dickey's brother, Bob Meyer, who was still on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin. He was actually a very well-regarded geophysicist. And what I didn't know at the time when I first contacted him, which was in the early 90s, that there was a biography of Dickey that had just come out. And the family wasn't very happy with all of the characterizations of Dickey. They felt that her work in life was very, very substantive, but the biographer chose to kind of focus on some personal details that they weren't necessarily thrilled about. And certainly, I'm not critical at all of the writer, a woman named Roberta Ostroff. But I can certainly understand from the family's point of view that there were certain things that they felt were just too personal. And they tended, I think, to be a fairly private family anyway. So, I think that they were expecting that the work was going to focus more on her work as opposed to her work and her life. And like everybody else, we all have messy things that go on in our life from time to time. And so that was the backdrop of what I had to work with. And so consequently, it took me at least 5 years or so of keeping at my conversations with Bob Meyer to try and get them to agree to let me try and work on developing a screenplay. And eventually, unfortunately, Bob died before we were able to do that. But fortunately for me, his wife Marion was remembered that Bob actually was, felt that I had a pretty good sense of what was important to them, and so I finally was able to get the rights to work on the screenplay. So interestingly enough, it wasn't necessarily just, yeah, absolutely, we're happy to do this, we're thrilled. They were very, very reluctant to do so, and so I feel very, very honored that they did kind of allow me the opportunity to work on her story. So I've always felt that was something that I have to be mindful about, is the fact that, Dickey Chappelle to us is a fascinating character, but to the Meyer family, it's their aunt, it's their sister-in-law, it's their sister, and so, it's still fairly close for them. 50 years down the line, it won't be such a problem. But in the near term, I felt that I really needed to kind of respect their wishes. Unfortunately for me, over time, they've come to realize that, they have certain feelings about Dickey as a member of the family, but they also recognize that in order for her story to be told, that you have to be open to the fact that there are some things that you may not necessarily prefer to talk about, but if handled respectfully, are important for people to understand her entire life history.
What about just being a war correspondent and photographer? Tell us about the quality of her work as juxtaposed to anybody else in the industry at the time. But forget the fact that she's female.
Right. Well, certainly during World War II, there were some giants that were out there that were in all aspects of the war, not only in the military and industry, and certainly in journalism, and the work of I was going to say Robert Capa certainly is one photographer that comes to mind as an extraordinary photographer, and we also have Ernie Pyle, who was just a great writer that was out there, and Dickey certainly knew of them. There were also a couple of people, Margaret Burke White, who did a lot of work for Life magazine, who probably was considered to be the best woman photographer of her time. And so I think that Dickey certainly did probably work in the shadow of Margaret Burke White. Later on in the Korean War, Marguerite Higgins came to prominence, and so she was very, very well aware of the fact that there were other women that for whatever reason probably had gotten into the privileged position of being that woman correspondent that people knew of, and of course they did deliver the goods with excellent work. And I think that's something that Dickey probably struggled with, is the fact that here she was doing some of the same stuff, but she couldn't get a lot of work in life. She did actually do some work for them and had some photos that did appear in life during the Hungarian uprising. But I think that she was always struggling against some of the other war correspondents, certainly of both genders, who were already well established, well regarded, and kind of considered the go-to people.
Again, we're talking to John Garafolo. He's a screenwriter, college professor, and also former entertainment industry and advertising executive. He's a vet of the Iraq War. He also is currently a commander in the U.S. Coast Guard Reserve on active duty, assigned to Coast Guard headquarters in D.C. He's the author of Dickey Chappelle, Under Fire, photographs from the first American female war correspondent killed in action. John, as we explore the life of Dickey Chappelle, what did she do like in the off years? I mean, when she was stateside, what would she do?
Well, actually, after World War II, she was not able to be a war correspondent, and essentially she had her military press accreditation withdrawn because her first combat experience was on Iwo Jima, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the war in the Pacific, and then later on, she covered the Battle of Okinawa, which probably was the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific. Unfortunately, she didn't have authority to go onto Okinawa, and she disregarded the Navy's orders that she not go ashore, and she went ashore anyway. And she hooked up with the Marines, who had a certain amount of trepidation about having a woman running around on Okinawa during that time, but they agreed to let her stay, and she followed a Marine field medical unit for about 10 days before the Navy realized where she was and were able to pull her out of Okinawa. And so the consequence for her doing so was they withdrew her military press credentials. So she was unable to actually cover war in any way, at least certainly with U.S. forces. So she was a staff photographer for 17 magazine for a short period of time, for maybe about a year or so after the war. And she had an assignment which took her to a Quaker-run camp in Kentucky. And so she had this opportunity to sort of see this kind of different side of everything, and that kind of inspired her. And so she was able to get an assignment with her husband to work for the American Friends Service Committee and travel around Europe and document Quaker relief efforts throughout Europe. And so that kind of dominated their work for like the next 6 or 7 years, where they were working for various relief agencies. They actually created one of their own for a while when there was no work from any of the relief agencies they had worked for previously, and so they just stayed in Europe and sort of were independent, was an independent relief organization, and essentially they were really there to do more photo documentation, and so essentially I think that was again a really pivotal moment for her because of the fact I think that she liked the excitement of covering war, and she I think was very enamored with the brave men that she had seen and nurses that she had seen in action. But then when she had sort of seen this tremendous need and really the opportunity to be on the on the sidelines for this rebuilding of the world, I think that was actually very satisfying for her as well.
You know, John, there are lots of interesting characters that have peppered American history, particularly when it comes to armed conflict. Why do you think Dickey Chappelle? Why is that story? Glad you did it, but why has it taken you to bring this more to light, do you think?
You know, that's the million-dollar question, and it's very, very interesting because I don't know that I have a good answer for that, other than I think that there may be some gender bias issues that had gone on. You know, certainly if you take a look at war reporting, it still probably is primarily considered to be a man's job or a boys' club, and there have been women that have kind of fought that convention, and there certainly are women right now that are out there doing some great work, and I mean very extraordinary work, and they are certainly putting themselves on the line. And you've heard a number of stories lately about women reporters that have been killed, and there have been women reporters that have been kidnapped and sexually assaulted. So it certainly is not an easy way to make a living, and it probably constitutes a calling to some extent. But in Dickey Chappelle's case, I found a great story that was written by Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, who had been a writer himself, and he was a military historian of note. And he and Dickey were friends. They certainly traveled in some of the same circles and stuff, covering wars and all that. And S.L.A. Marshall wrote I call it sort of a post-obituary obituary, because Dickey was killed in early November of 1965. And this obituary appeared maybe about the third week in November. And Marshall was commenting about, in fact, wondering that here you have this amazing woman war correspondent who did these great things, but yet fame, even in death, eluded Dickey Chappelle. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask. And it's sort of like, why would that be when, as Marshall points out, that her record was better than many of the men reporters, that she went into places that most men wouldn't even go to, and so her work was good, she was brave, and yet we still don't know about Dickey Chappelle. And I think that Marshall's question still is sort of a fair question to answer now, or to ask now. And really, I sort of wonder about that myself. It really still remains a mystery to me, because I think that she really is somebody that should be a topic of discussion in the United States, and it shouldn't be looking for this historical footnote that's interesting and this intrepid woman, and we just don't know about her in general, and I think it's a shame.
Well, it is a fascinating work, uncovering and shining a light on really an unsung hero here. Dickey Chappelle under fire, photographs by the first American female war correspondent killed in action, the author John Garafolo, who's been our guest for the last half an hour or so. John, appreciate you joining us here. How can people find out more about the work and the writing that you do, and also maybe pick up a copy of the book?
Well, right now, fortunately, the book is available online. It is available on all independent booksellers, and for people that like their independent bookstore, you can certainly check them out. Look at on indiebound.org to find a bookstore, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com. are currently carrying it, and my understanding is it should be in bookstores by the end of the month. So hopefully it's pretty easy to find right now, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about Dickey Chappelle today. It's been great.
Well, good. We do appreciate it. What's next for you?
Well, actually, I was hoping to really have an opportunity to work on the Chappelle screenplay at earnest, but believe it or not, I ended up getting a grant to write a play. So right now, I'm trying to finish up a play about Dickey Chappelle. It's a one-woman show, is at least my initial thought, and so hopefully I'll get that wrapped up fairly soon. And there's at least one theater that's interested in taking a look at it. So hopefully that'll come to pass.
Well, best of luck to you, and again, thanks so much for joining us today, and best of luck.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity. You have a great day, too.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.